Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on what's coming up for UNEP banks in 2020. We see people are still coming in. Always takes everyone a couple minutes longer to make it into the system than expected. So hopefully it's okay for all of you that we get started in a couple of minutes so we can get started with everyone on board. Thanks for your patience.
Hello. We're still getting some background noise. Could you check your music on? Okay. You might want to check pause. I just pressed the mute button.
Yep. No, not now.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. And once again, welcome to this webinar on what's coming up for UNEP member banks in 2020. And thanks for joining us in such good numbers. People are still coming in, but I do think it is time we get started together. 2019 has been a big year for UNEP banks, together with a coalition of over 130 banks, representing over 50 trillion, and with that over a third of the global banking industry. We have launched the Principles for Responsible Banking in September, and with that, UNEP member banks have given themselves, but also the global banking industry, a new framework to align banking with society's goals. By now, we have over 160 signatories, and in general, over the course of 2019, UNEP has increased its banking membership by over 50%. So a special welcome to all our new members. I think for many of you, this is the first time you're getting the full spectrum of UNEP activities. So there is a lot of great cutting edge work going on. And I dare say you will find a lot of activities that suit your needs and interests and can help you advance. By signing the Principles for Responsible Banking, banks have made some quite far-reaching commitments to strategically align their businesses with the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals, and to massively scale up their contributions to the achievement of both. And of course, in practical terms, that includes target setting in those areas where the banks have their greatest impacts. Banks are required to set and publish targets, and of course, based on a strong impact analysis. And banks are required to be transparent and accountable. Sorry, we do have a colleague who hasn't muted himself. If I can ask the colleagues once more to do so. And all that is quite a lot of new and challenging work for all the banks. And so UNEP's project initiatives, trainings, activities in 2020 really will support banks in their implementation of the principles. There will be a working group structure specifically to support implementation. You haven't seen that in the What's Coming Up document yet because it's still in the works, but my colleague Pouleng will give you an initial idea already today. And beyond that, there are quite a number of fantastic projects and initiatives across our different thematic areas led by our expert teams that will support banks in implementing the principles, but also banks that haven't become signatories yet to advance on sustainable banking in the areas of climate, of ecosystems, and of impact. With that, let me move to today's agenda. Those of you who are dialed in via phone, you have received the slides yesterday, so you can follow offline. For all the rest of you, of course, you follow with us on the screen. So we're going to start by looking at the structure that is being put in place to help banks specifically in implementing the principles for responsible banking. My colleague Pouleng is going to talk about that. And then we're going to move to our thematic experts. We're going to start with impact. Our impact lead, Karine, is going to present on the activities there. We're going to move to climate, where our climate experts, David, Paul, and climate lead Remco are going to present. Ecosystems is going to be our Liesel van Ast. And then we're going to move to some very exciting Europe-specific projects, very timely with the EU taxonomy, and with a strong focus on energy efficiency. We're going to have an outlook on the big flagship events of UNEP this year, and a quick overview of our training. And then we're going to spend a minute on next steps. You have already received the What's Coming Up for UNEP banks in 2020. So a lot of the information you have already. So this today is really the opportunity to interact with and ask questions to our experts. So please do make use of that. Let's make this as interactive as possible. We will do a Q&A after every single one of these segments, so you can make sure to ask our experts all the questions you're interested in, be that about the content of the project or about how to participate and who from your bank should participate. So please make use of that. When we come to those sections, there are two ways to ask your questions or make your comments. One is through the chat box. So you can put your questions in there, and you can already do that throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait. Then we can all have them ready at the end of the presentation of that segment. Or you can raise your hand. There's a little raise your hand button. And then we'll go and unmute you, and you can have a direct conversation, which of course is also quite rich usually. With that, one little note or explanation to those of you who are really still new to UNEP. Today we're talking about banking. So all the activities that are available for our banking members across our different thematic areas, and we're going to also look a bit specifically at our European team. Of course, UNEP is much broader than just banking. There is investment and there is insurance, not going to be part of today's webinar, but I know many banks are quite diversified. And so if you're interested, for example, in our investment activities, then let us know, and we can include you in information on that later as well. So with that, let me hand over to our first speaker, Puleng, in UNEP FI's climate team, and she's gonna give you an idea of what the implementation support structure for specifically the principles might look like over the coming months. Puleng.
Thank you very much, Simone, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody who has joined this webinar. So as Simone has said, I will be presenting the implementation structure that is proposed at this time. So let us get started. Let us go to the next slide. Simone, can you please move to the next slide? Thank you very much. So as most of you would be aware, we had asked signatory banks to undertake a gap and needs analysis, which was due in December. And so, we've looked through all of those. We received 90, and we have identified certain priority areas that will really inform this implementation structure that we're in the process of putting together. We can move to the next slide. So, as I have said, this is proposed. We do need to, as a secretariat, take it to the core group. These are the 30 banks that worked together to develop the principles for responsible banking. So we will be in discussions with them over the next few weeks to basically fine-tune what we've developed here, take their input on board, make necessary amendments, and then we'll be sharing it with signatories thereafter. So I will very quickly just go over the various working groups that we have identified in order to meet the needs and support areas that banks have overwhelmingly asked for. And to just make a note as I start that signatory banks are encouraged to participate in these various working groups and to lead them, but we'll get to those logistics a little bit later. So the first working group we call the Working Group on Communications and Knowledge Sharing, and the purpose of this working group would be to effectively make sure that all signatories are on the same page with regards to the PRB requirements. And we do this by packaging information in ways that are friendlier to consume. They'd also be responsible for basically, packaging the various pieces of work approaches that come out of the other working groups that we will cover, and also for communication, so coordinating external communications and media campaigns around PRB implementation. You'll see underneath each working group that we've got a profile for what working group members would look like. You can look at that at in your own time, and we don't have a lot of time right now. The second working group would be looking at impact, and the way that we see this working would be, you would be aware that we have a working group that has been developing the impact identification tool. That working group is going to go into testing very soon. My colleague Corinne will speak a little bit more to that in the next segment. And so once the tool has been tested and released, this particular working group would then be responsible for one aspect of it is socializing the tool, so effectively doing presentations, some training on how you use the tool, and then actually using the tool as a working group to do impact analysis, bringing the feedback back into the working group, obviously being mindful of competition issues, discussing what that output looks like, interpreting those results, and then also feeding back to the secretariat and the banks that had initially worked on putting this tool together about how we can improve and enrich the tool, which will then be worked into the tool. That then would lead into the next working group that sits under impact, and that's the working group that will be focused on based on the feedback that we're receiving, where are we seeing gaps that we need to be filling, in order to make sure that all banks can do complete and coherent impact analysis. Let's move on to the next. The next working group or working groups are around targets. And here we would effectively have three work streams. Two fall under, the collective commitment to climate action. And here we would have one working group that's looking at, learning from and applying existing methodologies and experiences. And then another working group that's looking at developing common standards, guidance for comparable target setting, looking at, how we measure progress and monitor progress and what we report. And then the last one under the target setting would be a working group that's looking at, how do we develop indicators, metrics, and methodologies for where we're setting targets in areas that are outside of climate. And so here, what we're thinking of is that, based on the feedback that's already coming out of, the impact analysis, what are the key areas, so the areas of most significant impact that are coming up most commonly across signatories, and to start focusing on those. So this will be more of an SDG focused working group, if I can put it that way. So all things that are outside of climate, and we're thinking that, maybe we start with the top 5, and what could be included there are issues like biodiversity, gender equality, and decent employment. Moving on to the fourth working group, that would be on reporting and assurance. And here, this working group would really be responsible for two things. What we're seeing is a small group of banks within this working group that work together with assurers to develop criteria for, if an assurer needs to do undertake an assurance process on the self-assessment that has been reported by a bank, what are the criteria that assurer would use? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is to create a platform where banks that are already in the process of reporting can share approaches, how they're thinking about reporting, and have discussions with each other, and out of that perhaps develop some kind of common approaches to how to report, and that would obviously then be shared with other signatories. Moving on to working group number 5. So here we call this the peer learning working group. We had a lot of feedback from banks saying, we need assistance with implementation, and a lot of this came up around how do we work with our clients and customers, how do we develop a strategy, and how do we engage with our stakeholders. So these are kind of the key areas where this peer learning working group would be focused on, and here really it's about banks learning from each other. So banks that are leading in these various areas, sharing with other banks, how they have approached these things, and other banks then learning from that. Working group number 6 would entail progress monitoring and evaluation. And here, this working group, to note, it would be looking at this from a collective level. They'd be looking at what does successful implementation of the principles look like, and what indicators and metrics to use to measure that progress, as well as what monitoring and evaluation mechanisms need to be put in place. So those are effectively the 6 working groups. As I said, we still have a lot of engagement to do before we can finalize this. Let us move on to the timeline. So what we, the way forward would be that, as I said, we're going to engage with the whole group. We will then share, what this implementation structure for PRB looks like with signatories by mid-March. We will also then issue a call for signatories to put themselves forward to lead these various working groups or to participate in those working groups. Once we have that feedback, we'll then, the Secretariat will then engage with those banks that have put their hands up. We'll compile the various working groups, and then we will set up the kickoff calls for these various working groups, and we envisage envisage that the work of the working groups will begin at the beginning of May. So that is a very high level, very quick overview of what to expect in terms of PRB implementation and support and the various activities and working groups that banks can get involved in. And I think with that, I will hand over for questions before we move on to the next section.
Thank you very much, Puleng. Yeah, let's go to the audience and get their questions and comments. Once again, for everyone, there is a questions box where you can just type in your questions. We'll read them out for you, or you can raise your hand and then we can unmute you directly. We have a first question. Are there any specific requirements to join any of the working groups?
Okay, so with regards to that, I had mentioned that under each working group, we've got a certain criteria for, what would be most ideal in the people who volunteer or raise their hands to participate. So I think that can really be used as a guide for, what kind of expertise or experience one should have for specific working groups.
Okay, we have a second question here. Is there any specific working group where you need more banks to participate?
Well, as we said, we still need to really engage the core group on this. But I think where we would really want some numbers is really the impact working group. We do want to get feedback. We do want to enrich and make amendments to the tool. And overall, really that is an important area, and in many respects, a starting point. So we encourage as much uptake there as possible.
Okay. There are further questions here. Do banks get to choose to join only one working group?
Well, I think it would be encouraged that banks join only one working group, just because of the sheer amount of work that is going to be required. Simone, it seems like you want to come in. Is it about background noise?
I think, look, as you say, Puleng, banks need to realize how much work specific working groups are and need to be ready to put that in. But at the end of the day, you are open, of course, to participate in several working groups if you wish to. Absolutely. And another point to that, Simone, is that what you may also find is that you've got different colleagues within a bank that will participate in different working groups. So, you want to participate in more than one. Happy for you to do that. Just to note, though, that there will be a significant investment of time required per working group. We will be drafting a terms of reference that really sets out what it entails to actually be part of these working groups as well. Fantastic. Further question on the process. When and how do we need to apply to join the working groups? Okay, so if we look at the slide that's right in front of us in terms of the when, we will in mid-March be sharing the final implementation structure for PRB, and at the same time we'll be issuing a call for signatories to raise their hands to participate in the various working groups. So what we are looking at is, what you can expect is, an email kicking this off mid-March, and you'll have about 2 weeks or so. It will all be detailed in the email, but you'll have about 2 weeks to then get back to us regarding, which working groups you want to be involved in. And remember that you would be getting back to us as to whether you want to lead a specific working group or whether you want to participate. Okay, we have more questions coming in here, lots of interest. If we are not part of the collective commitment to climate action, but still need to report on climate, isn't it more practical to separate working group members based on their commitment to the collective commitment, since the requirements and needs are different? Not too sure about the last part around separating since their needs are different, but what I can say to that is, I think we have tried to cater, and we've broken that work down into 2 separate streams, right?
one that's really looking at what's already out there. Let's share experiences and knowledge around methodologies that already exist. And then we've got another one that's kind of looking at, well, what kind of guidance and common approaches can we basically develop together with regards to setting these targets and how we report on them. So we've already kind of split it in that way. And I would hope that that's satisfactory, but maybe that's something we need to take further. And Simone, since you've looked at that work, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe also clarify the question in the system if you feel we're not answering it correctly. I'm understanding a little bit you're suggesting to have the signatory banks to the collective commitment work separately, which is actually what the plan is. At the moment, the working groups under the collective commitment to climate action are only open to the signatories. Of course, their work and results will be shared regularly with all banks, but at the moment there is, in a way, a separation to ensure that they can progress in a timely and targeted manner, because they have to deliver on a commitment under fairly ambitious timelines. So if that didn't answer your question, please feel free to put in some more clarification. We want to make sure we answer everything. Okay, you say yes, it did. Good. Further question here: do you have to be a signatory to the principles before you can join? Maybe I'll take that one. We still have a number of banks in the membership that are not signatories to the principles for responsible banking, but where we understand they're interested to become signatories over time and would certainly benefit from the preparatory work and understanding more and more what that means. So there is no verdict on that at the moment, and we'll need to confirm what I'm saying now, but I would say the working group should be open to all banks that are interested in the principles, even if you're not a signatory yet. Where I would maybe caution a little bit is to raise your hand as a working group lead. But I think that can be looked at case by case. I hope that does answer your question. Then we have the next one here. If only joining one working group, how do we get the benefit from the other working groups? What's the plan to share the learnings more broadly?
Very, very good question. So we are very cognizant of this issue that you're raising, that banks can't join all working groups, but that all of the work that's happening in the working groups will be important for all banks. And so the strategy there really is for the outputs, the approaches that are developed in these various working groups to be shared with all signatories. What will become key then is that first working group that I made mention of, that's looking at communications and knowledge sharing. They will be tasked with taking those approaches and developments that are happening in those various working groups and really packaging them and then sharing them with banks. So, the work of that particular working group becomes key and instrumental in terms of sharing and distributing knowledge across signatories. Can't hear you.
Thanks, Pudding. I said we had one last question here in the system, and then I think we need to move to the next segment. Should we participate in a working group that is most suited to our needs and priorities, or in a working group where we have the best expertise?
That's a difficult question. How about both? It completely depends on your capacity, as we touched on earlier on. I think it's all about what makes the most sense for your bank. So I don't think I would want to make a call on that for you. I think it just really does depend on what makes the most sense for your particular bank, also bearing in mind that whatever sharings come out of the other working groups will be shared with you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot to everybody for this first round of questions. Very good questions, and I'm sure they help clarify for a lot of people, not just those who asked. So let's keep going with strong engagement like this. And let's move into impact. I think there has been a lot of work going on this in the last year, and also quite relevant to the principles for responsible banking. And let me hand over here now to our impact team lead, Karine App, who'll be presenting for us what's ongoing there and how banks can participate. Karine?
Thank you, Simone, and hello everyone. Lovely to join on this 2020 call and projection of everything that's happening. Perhaps just a tiny bit of background for those that are new to UNEP. Impact at UNEP is a fairly recent development in the sense that it became a topic and a stream in and of itself in 2017. And it's, I think the interesting thing about it is it cuts across, the different industries. So Simone was talking about the fact that, we have a call today on banking, but of course there are the insurance and investment streams. And we do have, thematic focuses on climate, on ecosystems, and impact, of course, is something that cuts across all of those. A lot of what we've done until now has been to look at, really how we bring the question of impact and effectively, working towards the end goal and having a results-based approach, basically, in mainstream finance. And so, this has been, I think, very much, a founding piece to also have a set of, banking principles that are indeed very, very ambitious. If you want, to get a sense of some of the grounding for that, we, in the past couple of years, we released a piece that kind of gives that grounding called Rethinking Impact to Finance the SDGs. And where you'll see that, we take an approach that really tries to look at this from the perspective of business and how impact becomes a business driver. But now, of course, a lot of the focus is on how we then take that forward in terms of implementation. While we did have a number of initial guidance documents and reference materials, including our impact radar and a number of model frameworks for corporate finance, for project finance. I think what's very exciting about 2020 is that there are some very hands-on tools that are coming out. Pooling has alluded to them. And so I think this is what we can focus on today just for a couple of minutes. Simone, I'm afraid, I'm traveling, so I cannot actually see the live deck. But perhaps you can move to the slide that shows, the summary on the two tools that are coming out, and I can say a few words about that. So if that's on your screens now, so effectively as I mentioned, there are two tools coming out. These are tools basically for impact analysis, and you can see there that we've put in a word, a very specific word, which is holistic. And so just to pause before we go further on that, very much the approach that we're taking at UNEP on trying to understand and manage impact is a view that indeed for this to become very much a business driver and to be able to capture all the opportunities associated to delivering results, a holistic approach is going to be very important. And by holistic, what we mean is that we consider environmental, social, and economic impacts side by side and have a global view of these. And that not only do we do that, but that we also look at both the positive and the negative for those three dimensions in a very systematic way. So in terms of the two tools, these are effectively two very complementary tools. As mentioned by Simone and Pooling, in the context of the principles for responsible banking, there's a very clear requirement set out that targets be set against those impact areas that are most significant. So basically, where it matters most. And so the first tool that is coming out and that we're working on with a number of you is what we sometimes like to refer to as a top-down tool. It's a portfolio level tool that will help you effectively gain an understanding of what are the main impact areas associated to your portfolio. When we talk impact areas, what we mean is basically impact themes or areas. So that it could be climate, it could be water, it could be a social theme, whether that's employment, whether that's housing, or other. And that analysis is really something that we're taking now to a stage where we ground that in the reality of your portfolio. So what is it that's being financed? In what geographical reality, what kind of financing are we talking about, to which kinds of businesses? That is, the set of elements from which we derive what effectively, the general impact profile of your different portfolios look like, and as a result, what are the impact areas that really need to be looked at, and against which it would make sense to set targets. So this is really the top-down view of understanding where one needs to focus on. The second tool we sometimes refer to as a bottom-up tool, because effectively what we're then looking at in this tool is specifically at a client's level what the story is on their impact profile. Because there comes a point, obviously, when to be able to then, set detailed targets, and most importantly, to be able to reach them, we're going to need to act at effectively the individual level of corporates, at transaction level, and to understand the reality of, particularly those most systemically important clients, what effectively can be done to reduce their negative impacts and increase their positive impacts. So that corporate tool effectively meets you at an opportune moment once the top-down view has been completed, and will be then something that you can use to make a number of decisions. So obviously, the most extreme decisions are to stop something, but what we're most interested actually is in the fact that this tool will enable you to get a good global holistic understanding of the client, so that transition paths can basically be explored, because in the vast majority of cases it will not be a simple question of removing or adding a new investment, but actually working with existing clients and really trying to see what it is that can be done to increase the positive impacts, reduce negative impacts, and very much to also start thinking about their business models and how positive impacts can become much closer to their value proposition and their cash flows, basically. So those are the two tools. Simone, I think what's important, of course, is that we have time for questions. So if you just want to move to the second and last slide, here's a timeline in terms of when this will become available. So we're basically completing these tools as we speak, and about to embark on a final round of testing with the working group members for the two tools. And I'd like to raise an invitation here, really, which is that even if you've not been part of the working group until now, but would be interested in an early insight into the tool and to also help us to test ahead of releasing our first iteration of this tool, basically, then you're very much welcome to do so. This is a little bit the last boarding call. If you'd like to do this, then just let us know by the end of this week, basically, and we should be able to still onboard you onto that process. Once we have that testing completed, we'll be aiming to release the tools in March. As Tuling already pointed out, a lot of further work after that in terms of explaining, unpacking, and continuing to improve the tools, including a number of reviews and partnerships with other organizations that will help us to continue to consolidate this. So I think with that, Simone, I hand it back over to you, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Corinne. We do indeed have a few questions. First one, will the target setting at portfolio level be based on financing volume or based on specific indicators measuring impact? Corinne, do you want to take that? Otherwise, also happy to do it from the site.
Okay. Well, what I can say, Simone, is that the two aspects that are mentioned are important. The question of how much of an activity how much space an activity takes within your portfolio and the bank's revenues is a factor to take into account in the sense that that is also potentially where you might have more leverage and what will make a difference overall to your portfolio. But obviously, yes, it's also a question of specific indicators. Ideally, what we want is, of course, to work back from overall goals. And of course, you do have the example of the climate targets. So these are both factors that will be important. But Simone, if you want to say more on that, please.
No, fully agreed. Both your portfolio exposure, so how much you finance certain sector, and the intensity of the impact of those sectors on issues like climate or employment, etc., are to be taken into account, as well as your country context. So what are really priority challenges and objectives for your country? So it's this trias that is to be looked at in terms of determining the most relevant impact areas and targets. And the tools that Corinne talked about very much follow that approach as well. I hope that answered the question. If not, once again, please do put some follow-up into the boxes here. And then we have a series of questions here that I might just read out together because they're a bit together. The top-down tool is very interesting. So that's the portfolio tool. What is the granularity of the data needed? What is the workload to test the tool? Will the tool be web-based? Like PACTA, and if it is web-based, how will data security be handled?
Okay, maybe taking that last point first. So the tool will be available for download online. So it will be fully open source. Well, not the tool, the tools, both of them. However, it is not web-based in the sense that information that you capture is then kept on a web platform of any kind. You download, and then that file is with you internally. As a point of clarification, this is actually going to be in Excel format. The reason for that being precisely a question of accessibility, because we're very conscious of firewalls, and we don't want those to get into the way of you being able to access and benefit from the tool. And secondly, because we want a very high level of transparency in terms of how the tool is being constructed. We don't want any black boxes around the assumptions and the mappings that are included inside the tool. So hopefully that resolves the question that was posed on data confidentiality. Regarding the testing, what that implies in terms of the granularity of the information, effectively the testing involves basically trying to fill a series of data points. And then what the tool does, it takes that data and links it to a series of, impact mappings and, a series of guidance points that we have throughout to gradually orient you to an understanding of, what your significant impact areas are, to get a sense of what you know and don't know about your performance, and hence provide you a basis for target setting. So there are indeed there is a data collection effort. That data collection effort is proportional really to the size and diversity of your bank. So for a bank that is operating principally in one country and that will maybe not have any investment banking and capital markets activities, will be much quicker than for a big multinational bank acting obviously in many countries and across multiple portfolios. For those latter cases, what we do envisage, though, for the testing, you may wish to start by testing on one of your portfolios and on a certain scope of countries. Of course, if that's the case, then we would be requiring you to be focusing on, again, those that matter the most and that are very much core to your business. But that's I guess an overview of what's expected and what's required, but happy to provide more details on that and to provide with the tool so you can see.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Corinne. We have one more question in here that's very bank specific. Adal Haidur, if that's okay for you, if you want to copy paste it in an email to Corinne and me. And there's one more question, Corinne, that's for all banks, and then we do need to move on in the interest of time. We have a few more segments to cover. Quickly, Corinne, very quick answer. What sector classification system does the tool use?
Easy to answer that one. We're basically using AIESEC, which is the international industry code that was set up by the UN. This is the industry code from which all regional or national industry codes have then been derived, whether that's the NACE code, NAICS, ANZIC, and many others at national level. The reason for that was because we wanted indeed a global standard, but there is a converter tool that will help you to navigate back and forth from AIESEC to other codes as well.
Wonderful. I think with that, once again, thanks very much for the active participation and questions. Let's move to the next segment on climate. We still have a few activities to go through. Thanks a lot, Corinne. And that brings us over to our climate team lead, Remco Fischer, who will give us a quick insight into the collective commitment to climate action. Remco?
Hi, Simone. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Remco Fischer here. I hope you can hear me okay. My voice is a little bit under the weather, so I apologize for that. We're going to have a few interventions now on the theme of climate change. Before we go specifically into each one of those, including the collective commitment to climate action, though, just a few words on the overall spectrum of things that we're doing on climate change at UNEP and across the three industries, including banking. So in essence, we are responding to what are the most important mandate-giving frameworks out there on climate change. And really, there are three. There is the Paris Agreement, whose objective it is to ensure the climate stability in the medium to long term and to limit the mean global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. There is then the TCFD framework, which is a climate financial stability framework to safeguard, to ensure the financial resilience.
Remco, if you're still speaking, we have lost your audio. Remco, we do not hear you anymore. Can I just get a confirmation from one of the other panelists that they also don't hear Remco and that this is not a problem on our side?
Hi, Simone, it's David. Yeah, I don't hear Remco either, so.
Okay, Remco, unless we get you back. Okay, and the participants say they don't hear him either. Let me just jump in real quick then, so we don't lose too much time. The collective commitment to climate action, we've already talked a bit about it under the PRB implementation working groups. 36 of the Principles for Responsible Banking signatories, representing 17 trillion US dollars, have signed this collective commitment. It is the most far-reaching pledge on climate alignment out there by the global banking industry, with tangible steps towards putting the commitment to align the business with international climate goals into practice. So it sets out concrete and time-bound actions that banks will take to scale up their contribution to and align their lending with the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement. That includes aligning their portfolio to reflect and finance the low-carbon, climate-resilient economy that is required to limit global warming to well below 2, striving for 1.5 degrees, to taking concrete action within a year of joining, using their products, services, client relationships to facilitate the economic transition that we require to achieve climate neutrality in time, and to being publicly accountable for their climate impact and progress on these commitments. There is, of course, more information on this collective commitment to climate action, including the full text. You see the link on the slide. All Principles for Responsible Banking signatories are very much encouraged to join this collective commitment to climate action if climate change is one of their areas of most significant impact. If your bank is interested in doing so, please reach out to us. And of course, part of what this commitment means is that the banks are working together on target setting, on sharing methodologies and experiences, and delivering on this. So it is a great way to really benefit from international collaboration on advancing in your own bank on this topic. With that, I'll hand over to David, who will talk about the CCSD pilot. David, over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Simone. So, just in the interest of time, I'll try to be quick. And obviously, I know many of you, and I hope that for those of you who aren't in our TCFD banking program, that you feel free to reach out after this conversation. But I wanted to talk a bit about the work that we're doing, first on the transition risk side and then on the physical side. So we have a group of about 40 institutions around the world, so on 6 continents. And what we're really working to do is build off the work that was done in 2017 and 2018 around the development of climate risk methodologies. And our real vision here is to help these institutions improve their analysis of climate risks, both transition and physical, and also move toward better climate risk governance, ultimately resulting in strong climate risk disclosures as formulated by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. So the work that we're doing now has really kind of kicked into gear with the next couple months being a introduction to the latest scenarios from a couple leading climate modelers from the Potsdam Institute and IAESEC based in Vienna, work with Cicero on understanding the scenario landscape and its relevance and implications for financial institutions. We're also going to have a new transition risk web tool, which takes the methodology from the first phase and puts it into a online format that will make it more broadly accessible. Will also make it easier to build inferences across the program. And in addition to that, we'll be looking at some of the key sectors. Our group focuses on on 6 major sectors that are likely to be impacted by the transition. And so looking at those include things from real estate to energy. We're looking at, within those groups, coming up with a view on the associated risks. So for those of you less familiar, thinking about transition risks in terms of policy changes that may take place, thinking about technology and other innovations that may displace, current market incumbents and therefore increase the risk to current portfolios. The last thing I'll mention on the transition side before moving to the next page is we're also interested in understanding better what current climate risk governance practices are and how those can be enhanced in the future. And we especially have an eye on the stress testing regime that has been issued in the discussion paper from the PRA in Britain. And so thinking about, what kind of skills, what kind of governance is needed to ensure the successful running of a climate stress test is something that we'll cover near the end of our program. So I'll move on to the physical risk side now. Kind of the flip side of transition risk is physical risk. As we take more action on climate, we tend to create greater transition risks as this move needs to be rapid, as you've probably seen from the conversations in Madrid at COP25, as well as from the latest IPCC reports. We do need a rapid drawdown, a rapid move toward decarbonization. And the rate that occurs will, help to mitigate and help to minimize some of the worst effects of global warming, of climate change. However, on the other end of the spectrum, there are risks that are posed by inaction and by slower action, and also that are currently baked into the system. And this is a place where, rather than using some of the more traditional risk measures, which I think are pretty broadly applicable to the transition risk side, we're looking at greater granularity around mapping data, around scientific views of future and current extreme events. And so what we've put together on the physical side with a series of partners is really a top to bottom view of what are the pieces in this puzzle of physical risk that you need to assess this comprehensively. So looking at correlations between portfolios and physical risks, looking at the particular risks that are that impact macroeconomic performance, and also thinking about the distinct assessment frameworks and criteria, given that this is, in a lot of cases, so locationally dependent. So all of those are things that we're looking to put together in a kind of blueprint for physical risk at the end of Q2. The last thing I'll mention on our program that we're really excited to announce is we're working on building a climate risk hub, a UNEP FI climate risk hub that will not only take the materials from our program, both on transition and physical risk, but will really hopefully serve as a one-stop shop for our financial members to better understand both the impacts of climate change, the latest tools that we've used within our pilots, the latest scenarios, as well as the latest dialogue coming from regulators. So that's where we're at. I think it's an exciting point where we're both looking forward towards some of the future developments and future pressures across the industry, but also really getting into the specifics of the scenarios and specifics of the data. So I'll leave it there to give it back to you, Simone, to see if there are questions or anything else that we can cover before moving on.
Thanks a lot. We will go through the third project under climate, and then we'll take all the questions on the climate activities together. And with that, I'd like to hand over to our colleague, Paul.
Hi, thanks, Simone. Hi to everyone. My name is Paul Smith. And firstly, I'd like to talk about the Climate Resilience Risks and Opportunities Coalition. This is really our initial commitment in response to the physical risks of climate change. And I'll just give a brief bit of background about where this initiative came from. UNEP FI was engaged by the Global Commission on Adaptation early last year to develop a paper on adaptation finance. And that was authored by Stacey Swan and Alan Miller of Climate Finance Advisors, and launched in conjunction with the Global Commission. The paper was published in July 2019, and you can find it on our website under climate adaptation. And we also have a webinar on Bright Talk, so if you go onto Bright Talk, you may be able to find that. And this paper provided background for the Global Commission's flagship report, which was launched just before the UN Climate Action Summit in September last year. And one of the key recommendations from our paper was the importance of climate-related physical risk measurement and disclosure. So on the back of this, we saw this as a potential quick win, and launched a commitment at the UN Climate Action Summit in September in collaboration with the Global Center on Adaptation, where 5 financial institutions committed to publicly disclose their physical risk by 2021. And you can see those 5 financial institutions along the bottom. It includes 3 banks from the principals, including Rabobank, Standard Chartered, and Yes Bank. And we're now asking you as PRB banks, if you are committed towards reporting on climate-related risk, to join this initiative, which aims to put the work that you are doing on climate-related risk, perhaps with David on the TCFD pilot, to make a public commitment to disclosing through your reporting mechanisms, with a particular emphasis on physical risk, because while climate mitigation action is moving towards alignment, we believe that the physical impacts of climate change, the response is best measured by climate risk disclosure. So the idea behind this, although it says 2021 up there, if you join now, we would only expect you to commit to public disclosure within 2 years. So that would be 2022 if you join this year. Secondly, this is not a technical forum, so we are not developing the methodologies. That's very much in David's hands on the TCFD pilot. And the aim is really to build a critical mass of financial institutions willing to publicly disclose as we move towards the Climate Adaptation Summit in October this year, and of course COP26 in November. And just a couple of other points. There are no fees towards this commitment, so it's very easy to join and to sign up. And lastly, it will provide something of a vehicle for discussion around adaptation finance. So we are currently developing a couple of articles for our website around how risk disclosure can perhaps accelerate financing towards adaptation measurements. We are also looking at the issue of capital flight, and hopefully, well, actually, we have already launched a webinar series. We had a first webinar around adaptation finance in December with guest speakers from Rabobank and from the NGFS. And that webinar series will continue throughout this year, every 2 months, hopefully. We'll be providing support to the Data Hub, as discussed by David. And we will also try and keep you up to date with the latest discussions with central banks about how they are looking at developing guidelines and standards on risk disclosure. So that's all on the Climate Resilience Risks and Opportunities Coalition. The second project I'm working on that is relevant for you is that we are working together with Climate Kick, which is the Climate Knowledge and Innovation Community, and is an initiative designed to bring public and private sectors together to tackle climate change through innovation and knowledge. And together with their funding and support, we wanted to crystallize the current thinking around climate change action by financial institutions. And as you well know, risk disclosure has been very well received and taken off in the finance sector. But now positive action is increasingly being led by those financial institutions which are willing to align their portfolios over time with the Paris Agreement, so through the principles, and on the investment side through the Asset Owners Alliance. So through this thought piece, we wanted to establish the philosophy and thinking behind this rapidly changing landscape of climate action by financial institutions, and then looking forward, what would be the next steps beyond that. We are engaging two authors, Ben Caldecott of the University of Oxford and Dennis Pamlin of the Research Institutes of Sweden. And what is most relevant for you is that we are convening a review panel, which will include panelists from across the financial sector, but will include two banks from the PRB. So we've already sent out an email, which you may have seen. And if you're interested in joining this panel, unfortunately, there will only be two places, so it's going to be we're going to have to make a very informed choice. But if you're interested in this, you can respond by the 3rd of February to me at paul.smith@un.org. The timetable for this project will be kicking off in mid-February. And for the review panel, there will be a 3-stage process where you will review the framework of the paper, and then a first draft, and then a final draft. If you are not members of the review panel, the review of the final draft will take place in a workshop, and you will be able to dial into that workshop and hear the final draft before the paper is published in May. So that's all from me, Simone.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Okay,
wonderful.
thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an overview over the climate work, and we have a few questions on that. First one is around the TCFD project. David, how can banks participate?
So right now, as I mentioned, we're kind of in relatively full swing here. I think that, so I didn't explicitly advertise it just because I think we're kind of ramping up, but if somebody has a real interest, I'd love to speak with them individually. So please, if they can just reach out to me, david.carlin@un.org. We'll have a conversation about their current disclosure plans, and I can also tell them about potentially joining this phase, and if that's not feasible with their timelines and our timelines, then certainly in a future phase of the work, getting them fully integrated there.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot, David. We have a few questions on portfolio alignment. Remco, are you back?
I am back, Simone. Apologies to you and everyone.
Let's go through those. Regarding portfolio alignment, will there be any efforts to harmonize measuring target setting with Pacta Terra, PCAF, or science-based targets for FIs? There are a few more in the same way. Also, will this also include harmonization of the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions of financed activities?
So I can have a first stab at that. Thank you for those good questions. I mean, if you look at our own UNEP FI activities in this space, whether it is on banking, the collective commitment to climate action, or on the investment side, the net zero asset owner alliance, one focus area in all of this is how do we make sense as a unified community of committed financial institutions of this existing and pretty vibrant landscape of methodological development, criteria development, framework development when it comes to the issue of aligning portfolios. So absolutely, this is the priority for now, and we have to start delivering answers on how we will relate to that landscape and how we will help harmonize and standardize that landscape. And you've mentioned the usual suspects out there that we already are in touch with, and that we will continue to be in touch with as UNEP FI. We don't see ourselves as methodological providers. We don't see ourselves at all to be creating something new. Rather, looking what's out there and how can we bring it together in a way that makes best sense for UNEP FI members and for the credibility of the commitments.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Remco. We have a question here for Paul. Paul, what kind of banks would you welcome to participate? banks who already disclosed climate physical risk assessments and have a methodology on this. So I'm assuming this pertains to the Climate Resilience Risks and Opportunities Coalition.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. I think it's probably most relevant for those banks that are intending to disclose in line with the TCFD recommendations within 2 years. But we're not insisting that you join up now. I think it would be great if we can build a critical mass towards the end of the year, particularly towards COP26. But we will keep the commitment going beyond that. So I think in the short term, it'll be most relevant for those that are developing methodologies or have already disclosed. So perhaps initially targeting those that have been involved in phase 1 of the pilot and now in phase 2 of the pilot. But if you are developing methodologies independently, the TCFD pilots, yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. And then one last question here for the climate team, maybe Remco, that's an overarching one for you. What is the difference for banks between joining TCFD, Climate Kick, which I think is the guiding portfolio alignment paper, or PCAF?
Okay, so I think this is why my little intro would have been useful, that then I was unable to fully deliver for the technical difficulty. But I think, fundamentally, what we're doing is responding to the Paris Agreement, and within the Paris Agreement, Article 21C, to align financial flows. And if your bank wants to be part of that response, then the Climate Kick project on portfolio alignment, as well as the collective commitment to climate action, are your platforms. At the same time, or the platforms, the UNEP FI platforms that you should consider joining. At the same time, we continue responding not only to the Paris Agreement, but also to the TCFD, which is complementary to the Paris Agreement. It focuses on climate change. It's pertinent to financial institutions, but it follows a different mandate. So if you are interested in climate resilience, climate risk disclosures, and becoming climate risk savvy, then you should be looking to join our TCFD pilots, or if you are particularly interested in the physical risk part of the equation, the Climate Resilience Risks and Opportunities Coalition. But this is how one needs to dissect this fairly complicated landscape to be able to make sense of climate change related challenges for your financial institution.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Remco, for this clarification. If there is more need for clarification, I'm sure the climate team will also be very happy to engage in a one-on-one conversation there to guide you. In the meantime, let's move on to our ecosystems team. And with that, I would hand over to Liesel van Ast. Liesel.
Thanks very much, Simone. So on ecosystems, we have several projects that you can get involved in. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The first is the tool which we developed last year, which is available online already, so you can access that. And this is really about linking your portfolios to the risks from biodiversity loss, ecosystems degradation. And so you may have seen this year the World Economic Forum report showed that, the Global Risk Report showed that biodiversity loss and environmental issues are in fact the top 5 global risks right now for the next decade. And a report which was released there, Nature Risks Rising, showing that there's around 44 trillion of economic value that is dependent on ecosystems. This analysis was actually based on using the Encore tool to come up with that research. So you can actually use it to apply in your own portfolios. With it covers 168 sectors. 67 sectors. We're actually developing it over the next 4 months with UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center to integrate the impacts of sectors, so that it will include both the dependence of sectors on actually having access to water, soils, and so on, as well as the impacts of those sectors on nature. So it'll be enhanced, and there'll also be further information to include water information as part of the analysis. We're training is available to members. So if you're interested in having training on the tool and looking at how you can apply it, we can provide that. Just get in touch. It's been tested by banks around the world, so we can also give you examples, and there's some case studies in a report of how it's been used so far. So I think that's probably all I need to say about this project. Get in touch if you'd like to find out more. Next slide, please. Now, this is the next phase of that project. So it will go from looking at how do you assess the risks linked to your portfolios and the sectors that you're financing, to what do you then actually do about that, and how do you set targets that can help to address some of those risks. And so the next phase of the project is to look at how we develop the methodologies and try and answer some of the questions that you'd be asking about your impact of your how you can reduce the impact of your portfolios on biodiversity and align with biodiversity targets. So it's still in the scoping phase. This is funded by donors for the Swiss government, so it's all being developed over the next year with partners, including the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, who are very much bringing in the science-based targets approach to this project. So we're looking at mirroring, to some extent, as much as is feasible, some of the approaches on climate that Remco talked about on portfolio alignment with the, for example, 1.5 degree temperature rise target, to echo that approach in terms of biodiversity. Of course, it's really complicated with the different ecosystems and biodiversity, but we're looking at how do you simplify that down to indicators and targets and pathways that can actually be help inform target setting in the finance sector. And there's a lot of action you may have heard about already. Business for Nature, the corporate sector already mobilizing to look at how they can respond to the challenges and address this. Of course, from the policy perspective, there's a lot happening this year. It's a super year of nature. The Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties in October is actually the Paris Agreement moment for nature. And at the moment, that agreement is currently looking at setting a target of no net loss of biodiversity ecosystems by 2030. What that means essentially is zero land use change from 2030 onwards, and in fact increasing the coverage of land available to ecosystems and biodiversity after that to 2050. That's all still in negotiation, and we'll have a webinar in March to go into much more detail about this and what's happening. But so what you need to know for now is that we're developing this project. You're welcome to get involved in contributing to how the project and the tool take shape to make sure it's useful for you, it can be applied in your day-to-day systems. And we've interviewed 19 financial institutions already, and so just get in touch if you'd like to find out more and get involved. Next slide, please. The Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative, this is funded by the European Commission, and also we're expecting a bit more funding to develop guidance for the finance sector. So it's really around how do you contribute to SDG 14 about life below water. And so it's looking at what is the existing knowledge, expertise, good practice. We know some of our members from BNP Paribas, Credit Suisse, AXA, for example, are already setting quite ambitious targets and working on blue economy issues. So this means how are you financing shipping, fisheries, and also related sectors, of course, in upstream and downstream, tourism, and basically anything that touches on marine ecosystems, to look at how can the activities that are being financed be more in balance with marine ecosystems. So this is all being set up at the moment, and you'll hear a lot more about it over the next year. But if you'd like to find out more and get involved, please get in touch. Next slide, please. So on land use, we have several projects. I'll just touch on this one, which is the most advanced at the moment. This is also donor funded. The main point here is that there's training available if you're active in Liberia, Brazil, or if your portfolios are exposed to Paraguay, Indonesia, Liberia, Brazil. If you want to find out more about how you can integrate land use considerations, sustainable land use, into your systems, environmental social risk systems, ESG data, we can provide that training from the second half of this year. So that's all still in the development of the actual methodologies and processes and how to go about integrating it. If you'd like to find out more, please get in touch with our colleague Jonathan Gasons. His email is on the screen. And yep, we take it from there, and we'll let you know once training is available. I think that's it, a quick wrap up. As I mentioned, we'll have a webinar in March to go into more details, specifically on the biodiversity target setting project. And we'll hopefully speak to you then again. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Liesel. We have a couple of questions related to the setting biodiversity targets. First question, how will this work and the further development of the Encore tool help Principles for Responsible Banking signatories set targets on biodiversity? And a second one here is there any concept note or terms of reference for this project that can be shared with members?
Very good questions, but all of that is still in development. We have meetings for the next few days to look at the initial research results and to look at what is the most practical and feasible way of taking this forward. So this is why we'll follow up next month with much more details about the actual scope of the project and how we can make these connections. It's basically learning by doing, and we're trying to figure this out as we go along by looking at what's out there, what we can be applied, what is in development in the policy, science, and corporate sectors that can then also be applied in the financial sector. And of course, your inputs to make sure that what we're developing is actually a support tool to help you set biodiversity-related targets under the Principles for Responsible Banking. Your involvement in the project would help make sure that we can align it with what you're considering as your target setting. But that's definitely a connection, of course, we want to make sure that this is a support for implementing the principles, as well as, of course, the principles for sustainable insurance, where that's feasible. And we'll be developing the terms of reference over the next month or so for what it means to be involved in the project. It will be really about the time and your inputs into helping to make sure what we're doing is going to be useful, and testing methodologies further down the line. It will be over the next year that we're developing this.
Okay, thanks a lot, Liesel. Then with that, we've gone through the specific thematic themes, and we're heading into a couple of Europe-specific projects. And the first one will be presented by our colleague Elodie Feller, who has been one of the leading people in developing the EU taxonomy, which I'm sure all European banks are very familiar with. So it's fantastic to have such a distinguished expert here in the team. And she's, of course, leading our project with our banking members to see how the EU taxonomy can be applied to core banking products. Elodie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Elodie, we struggle hearing you.
Okay. Trouble is bad.
Yeah, easiest, you want to just come over real quick?
Yep.
Okay, everybody, give it a second. We'll just change chairs here real quick. I hear you speaking in the other room, but the tone is not coming.
All right. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elodie, and as Simone was mentioning, so we are involved in developing some guidance for banks on how to use the EU taxonomy. Some background on the EU taxonomy. So back in 2018, the European Union issued an action plan for sustainable finance, and as part of this action plan, it has developed developed the idea of issuing a taxonomy to define environmentally sustainable activities. As part of this, we've been engaged in the technical expert group, and sorry, I just jumped out of the office, I'm next door. And this taxonomy is aiming at defining what sustainable environmental economic activities mean for the European Union. In December of this year, the co-legislators, so namely the EU Commission, the Parliament, and the Member States, came to a final agreement to say that it will enter into the law, into EU law. The taxonomy will become mandatory for investors, but also for corporates under the non-financial directive in the European Union that include banks and their financial undertakings. And so with this, the taxonomy is indeed becoming mandatory for disclosure, in the EU starting 2021, and for, in the case of banks, for listed banks that have activities in the European Union. So with this in the background, we, in preparation of that, last year we partnered with the European Banking Federation and with our UNEP member banks to launch a project to assess the extent to which the EU taxonomy on sustainable activities could be applied to core banking products. Developing a taxonomy on sustainable activities is very much of an environmental performance exercise. So what the taxonomy does is it looks at all the sectors of the economy and focuses on those economic activities that make a substantial contribution to a number of environmental objectives, including climate change mitigation, adaptation, pollution, water, marine resources, biodiversity, ecosystems, and circular economy. And so when it comes to aligning your, at the portfolio level, when it comes to assessing how your portfolio complies with the taxonomy, you have to have a number of thresholds and a number of indicators that enable you to assess that level of alignment. So it's a fairly complicated exercise that has a number of challenges, including challenges around data, challenges around processes, around methodologies that are already in use in the banks. And so we have set up this working group to provide a high-level feasibility assessment of the EU taxonomy to core banking products, to share best practices, and to develop use cases where appropriate, develop use cases on the specific core banking products that the banks have chosen, including lending portfolios, including on project finance, and a number of other products and business lines. And we aim by Q4 of this year to issue recommendations to banks on how to go about assessing alignment of portfolios with the taxonomy, but also recommendations to the banking authorities, supervisory authorities, and the European Commission. If I move on to the next slide, can I move this slide? Yeah. Okay, thanks. So this is a group of, so we have for that a group of 25 banks. We have 7 banking associations that are participating. Banking associations are coming from the EBS side, and 5 observers. I mentioned already the European Commission, the European Banking Authority. It's a very obviously European, it's very European footprinted because this is about the EU taxonomy indeed, and it's the first jurisdiction to issue its own taxonomy. However, there are other taxonomies in the writing in other jurisdictions, including in Canada and China, and a number of other countries have actually made the commitment to develop their own taxonomy for sustainable finance. And so we hope that this report will, primarily serve the purpose of the aligning with the EU taxonomy, of course, because this is a matter of almost compliance in some respect. But that the recommendations on the how and the process can also serve other banks from other jurisdictions as they come to comply, or at least to align with their own taxonomies in their jurisdictions. I will leave this here. Thank you very much, Simone. Sorry for the.
If you could stay for a few more minutes, so we do questions after we had Martin. So this was on the EU taxonomy, but there is also a Europe-specific project on energy efficiency, and for that I would hand over to Martin Schoenberg. Martin?
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to present on our joint activities with the European Commission. So we have a joint activity called the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group, which has been going for several years. And essentially that has gone into its third phase recently. So what I'll do is I'll first sort of keen very briefly on why energy efficiency, why it matters to financial institutions, and then I will provide you some further information on the new working groups we are setting up. So this is actually a very interesting figure showing that on average banks are deeply exposed to real estate. So 44% of the average global balance sheet of banks is in the real estate sector, and that of course also means that finance permissions from banks are to a large extent in the real estate sector. And you will also, when you look at scenarios for climate mitigation, you will understand that energy efficiency makes up a major component of all mitigation pathways. It's a major chunk, probably also about 40%. So that means essentially that energy efficiency is central to efforts to align with the Paris Agreement. However, it's also actually a core component of TCFD activities. The EU's Sustainable Finance Taxonomy makes explicit reference to the building sector, and actually the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group provided the building sector inputs for the taxonomy, so there's a clear linkage there. But the EU, most interestingly, is also considering financial regulatory measures. So the new president of the European Commission is aiming to catalyze $1 trillion of new investment into climate and energy until 2030 with her Green Deal for Europe. And energy efficiency is positioned first within those efforts. So that essentially entails a series of measures aimed to provide the necessary concessionary finance, but also project development assistance to financial institutions. But it also entails a green supporting factor, which is under consideration by the European institutions. A green supporting factor would essentially entail relaxation of capital adequacy requirements for energy efficient mortgages. Similar measures have already been introduced in China. In Europe, of course, we first need to provide evidence for the fact that energy efficiency actually does improve the risk profile of energy efficient mortgages. And therefore, there's a range of activities on that topic within AIESEC. And then, of course, also with the Green Deal for Europe, there's an expectation that energy and real estate regulation and incentives will be tightened further. So that means in order to stay ahead of incoming regulation in the real estate sector, it is essential for banks to become more involved with energy efficiency. And that's when you go to the next slide, we can see that there are 3 working groups being set up at the moment. The first one I have already briefly referred to is on the financial performance of energy efficient loans. So this is to provide evidence potentially for a green supporting factor, but also to more widely look at the implications of energy efficiency for probability of default of mortgages, as well as non-secured loans, and also to look at the implications for loss given default, so several risk metrics, which will probably be interesting, not only for sustainability departments, but also for risk colleagues. And in that working group, we have financial regulators, such as probably the European Banking Authority, a few national regulators. We have about 8 financial institutions. And of course, we have policymakers and energy efficiency experts. That working group and all of these working groups are actually still accepting applications. So the European Commission and UNEP have launched a call for expressions of interest. And that call for expressions of interest is you can respond to until the end of this week. If there's a little bit of a delay, that's fine. But we are finalizing the working group composition by the middle of next week. So that would be the deadline for that. Similar for the best practices in energy efficient financial instruments. That working group is essentially looking at established financial instruments. We did a major report about 2 to 3 years ago, which was looking at established and emerging financial instruments for financing energy efficiency. And we will now track the most recent trends in terms of which financing practices are working well, which ones are emerging, what are some of the lessons learned. So this is a very applied working group where we're looking for financial institutions who have transactional experience in the optimal case with energy efficiency, of course, looking at blending of public and private sector sources of capital. And then finally, there's a working group on multiple benefits, which is looking for the non-energy benefits of energy efficiency. So not energy savings, but of course greenhouse gas savings, but also beyond that, impact on, for example, building occupier well-being, as well as macroeconomic impacts such as job creation and so on. And with that, I conclude my intervention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Martin. Much appreciated. We are aware that we are a bit over time, so thank you very much for bearing with us for a few extra minutes. And we do have a question on these Europe-specific projects. EU taxonomy, will the project be limited to financed activities in the EU?
Thank you. The short answer is no. So the way the taxonomy works is it applies to entities that market financial products in the EU, irrespective of where the asset is located. So if, for example, in our working group, some of the banks will do that exercise of assessing how the taxonomy may apply to assets located outside of the EU. So there will be international relevance in how the EU taxonomy applies.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. I think for the moment, we don't have any further questions on the Europe-specific activities. So with that, we'll move on, thank you very much, to the flagship events. And for that, I hand over to my colleague, Mustafa Chaudhry. Mustafa?
Yes, hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Simone. Thank you very much for staying for this long. Just to quickly let you know that we have announced that the UNEP Global Roundtable, which takes place every 2 years, will take place in Mexico City on the 13th and 14th of October this year. So please save the date in your diaries. We are sharing more information in the next couple of weeks, which is also when we open registrations. But if we move on to the next slide, please. So we will be focusing on banking, investment, insurance, climate change, ecosystems, biodiversity, positive impact, social issues, fintech. So all the work streams of UNEP, but also beyond, looking at what interesting things members are doing, but also looking beyond UNEP membership at what is going on in the sustainable finance world. On the 14th of October, we will also have the UNEP AGM. Again, we will share more details about that. So we will have that alongside the global roundtable. And then something new for this year, on the 15th of October, we will have a Principles for Responsible Banking Day. So whilst we will be covering banking at the GRT, we will have a full day dedicated to workshops about the Principles of Responsible Banking implementation. So please do put these dates in your diaries. We will be sharing more information on how to register and further details about the event in the upcoming weeks. Any questions?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mustafa. We'll take questions together with the training segment, but once again, to emphasize for our bank, this full day on exchanging the experiences from the first year of implementing the principles is going to be crucial to all of you. So please mark that in your calendars. 15th of October 2020, Principles for Responsible Banking Day. Learn from all your peer banks how they've progressed on implementation in the first year. With that, we got to the final activities segment on trainings, and we'll get a quick overview on that from Liesel, and then we will move into a final questions round.
Thanks, Simone. So the main point here is that the first 3 courses, Environmental Social Risk Analysis, Corporate Eco-Efficiency, and Climate Change Risks and Opportunities, which is essentially around the TCFD, taking the learning from TCFD implementation from the banking pilot and providing training on how to go about implementing. This is all available online. So if you go to our website, you can register for the courses available in the language in English, French, Spanish, and Chinese for the ESRA course, Environmental Social Risk Analysis, and Spanish and English for the other 2 courses, Climate and Corporate Eco-Efficiency. The other training programs, which you can see there on Green Bond, Responsible Investment, Sustainable Finance, and so on are all in-person workshops, which are only available on request, on sponsorship, on demand. So if you're interested in any of those, get in touch and we can provide further details or have a look at our website. And we are updating the environmental social risk analysis course this year to bring in some of the latest developments in sustainable finance. So look out for that too. We'll be launching it later on this year. Thanks, Simone.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Liesl. So reach out and visit our webpage if you're interested in trainings. Before we get to the next steps, one last opportunity to ask questions, specifically also on our flagship event and our trainings. I don't see anything in the questions box for the moment. Feel free to still put that in over the next couple of minutes. Let's in the meantime go through the next steps. Most important next step for you right now is contact the relevant working group and project leads for more information on or participation in the work and projects that are most suited to your needs and priorities. So make sure to take advantage of this fantastic work program we have going on here at UNEP FI. And then expect an updated version of this What's Coming Up for UNEP FI member banks in 2020 towards end of February. And then it will include the final version of the PRB, the Principles for Responsible Banking Implementation Working Groups, of which Puleng has given you an initial draft in the beginning. And then third, a quick outlook. We do need to still get the UNEP FI banking governance and resources fit for delivering on the Principles for Responsible Banking. That's ongoing. And there will be a general meeting of all banking members this spring to approve the final proposals. But before that, of course, we want to discuss with you, we want to engage with you, we want to get your inputs and views. And when I say view, I of course mean most strongly our governance body, your banking committee, your elected representatives. And so look out for a webinar invite for the end of February 2020. With that, let me check one more time if we have any questions. We do not. Then thanks again for bearing with us for an extra 15 minutes. And we hope this was helpful to you. And we hope for a strong collaboration with all of you, and that you find these activities really help you make change in your bank and move ahead on sustainable banking. Thanks a lot. Have a good day, and let's have a great year together. Bye-bye.